June 6th, 1944, 7:45 hours. The English Channel is a churning cauldron of slate-gray water and diesel fumes. Off the coast of Normandy, the coastline of Courseulles-sur-Mer is a jagged silhouette of concrete bunkers and steel hedgehogs, obscured by the thick black smoke of a naval bombardment that has failed to silence the German guns. Inside the bucking steel hulls of the landing craft assault, men of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division are drenched in sea spray and vomit. They are not merely fighting the tide, they are carrying the weight of a national memory, the ghosts of the 1942 disaster at Dieppe. As the ramps drop, the air is instantly displaced by the whip-crack of MG-42 fire. The water turns a dark, rhythmic crimson. While American observers on the command ships offshore watch the carnage at Omaha with bated breath, their eyes begin to drift eastward toward Juno Beach. What they see is a force moving with a terrifying, singular purpose. These are not the untested colonials some had whispered about in London's planning rooms. As the first Canadian boots hit the sand, they do not just find a foothold. They begin a relentless, violent sprint toward the heart of occupied France that will leave even the most hardened American generals questioning their own assumptions about the Cinderella Army. To understand the weight of the moment at Juno, one must first understand the unique pressure cooker in which the Canadian Army lived in the spring of 1944. For nearly 4 years, the bulk of Canada's ground forces had been garrisoned in England, watching, waiting, and training, while the British and Americans fought in North Africa and Italy. They were the best trained soldiers in the British Empire, yet they were largely unproven in high-intensity combat on the European continent. The exception, of course, was Dieppe. In August 1942, the 2nd Canadian Division had been sacrificed on the pebble beaches of Dieppe in a raid that turned into a massacre. Over 900 dead, nearly 2,000 captured. It was a tactical catastrophe, but it forged a grim resolve in the Canadian High Command. Commanders like General Harry Crerar and Lieutenant General Guy Simonds were obsessed with ensuring that when the Canadians returned to France, they would not be thrown away. They would be the spearhead. By 1944, the geopolitical landscape of the alliance was shifting. The United States, under the supreme command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, had become the dominant partner. The sheer industrial and manpower might of the U.S. meant that British and Canadian influence was waning. In the grand strategy meetings at Chaff, the Canadians were often viewed as a junior partner, a reliable but small component of the massive British 21st Army Group under General Bernard Montgomery. However, the planning maps told a different story. The invasion plan, Operation Overlord, assigned the Canadians a distinct and critical sector, Juno Beach. It sat right in the center of the British sector, flanked by Sword Beach to the east and Gold Beach to the west. But geographically and tactically, it was a nightmare. The reefs offshore were treacherous, forcing the Canadians to land later than the Americans at Utah and Omaha on a rising tide that hid obstacles. The German defenses at Courseulles-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer were among the strongest on the entire Normandy coast, second only to the bluffs at Omaha. American generals, particularly Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, were acutely aware of the risks. Bradley was a man of precision and caution. He looked at the maps and saw the potential for a catastrophic gap opening up between the British and American sectors if the center failed. If the Canadians at Juno faltered, the British at Gold and Sword would be isolated, and the American flank at Omaha would be exposed to a German counterattack from the east. The Canadian Army was effectively a single corps for the initial assault, yet it carried the expectations of a nation desperate to redeem the blood of Dieppe. The training regimen imposed on the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was brutal and specific. They practiced assault landings until the movements were muscle memory. They worked with the Royal Navy to perfect the timing of the amphibious tanks. But in the halls of London, where American officers mingled with British peers, there was a quiet skepticism. Could a force that had been sitting in England for years, whose only major experience was a disaster, hold the center of the greatest invasion in history? The skepticism was not born of malice, but of military pragmatism. The Americans were pouring millions of men into the theater. They were accustomed to the massive logistical footprint of their own operations. The Canadians were a hybrid force, equipped like the British, but with a distinct North American temperament that was often described as less rigid than the British Tommy, yet more disciplined than the American GY. As May 1944 turned to June, the tension in the staging areas of southern England was palpable. The Canadians were sealed in their camps, checking their kit, writing final letters. The American observers assigned to liaise with the British Second Army, under which the Canadians fell, noted the mood. It was not the boisterous confidence of the fresh American divisions, nor the weary fatalism of the British veterans. It was a cold, quiet anger. They were going back to France, and this time they intended to stay. The stage was set not just for a battle of territory, but for a battle of reputation. The Americans needed the Canadians to hold. The British needed the Canadians to follow the plan. But the Canadians needed to win. The anxiety regarding the Canadian sector was magnified by the operational maps at Southwick House, Eisenhower's advance headquarters. While the eyes of history often drift to the carnage of Omaha Beach, the Allied commanders knew that the success of the entire invasion hinged on the speed of the advance inland. The Americans at Utah and Omaha were tasked with securing a foothold and cutting off the Cottontam Peninsula. But the British and Canadians on the eastern flank had a different, perhaps more dangerous job. They had to attract and destroy the German armored reserves. General Sir Bernard Montgomery, the architect of the ground plan, had designed the operation so that the Anglo-Canadian forces would threaten the strategic city of Caen. Caen was a road hub, a vital artery for the Wehrmacht. Montgomery knew that if he threatened Caen, the Germans would be forced to throw their best panzer divisions against the British and Canadians to save it. This would, in theory, leave the Americans facing lighter resistance as they broke out to the west. This put the 3rd Canadian Division in a crucible. Their objective on D-Day was not just to take the beach. They were ordered to penetrate deeper than any other Allied unit, to seize the Caen-Bayeux Highway and the Carpiquet airfield nearly 10 miles inland on the very first day. It was an incredibly ambitious target, one that American generals like Omar Bradley viewed with private skepticism. To expect an infantry division to storm a fortified seawall and then fight through 10 miles of hedgerows against panzer counterattacks in a single afternoon seemed bordering on fantasy. The skepticism was compounded by the enemy disposition. Facing the Canadians was the German 716th Infantry Division. While largely a static unit, they were dug into a labyrinth of concrete bunkers, towbrucks, and anti-tank ditches that had been personally inspected by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had flooded the low-lying areas behind Juno, forcing the attackers into narrow kill zones along the few causeways leading off the beach. Worse still, lurking just south of Caen, was the 21st Panzer Division, a veteran unit equipped with Mark IV tanks and commanded by experienced officers. Allied intelligence, including the American G2 staff, knew the panzers were there. If the Canadians stalled on the beach, or if they failed to link up with the British at Gold Beach, the 21st Panzer could drive a wedge of steel right down to the sea, splitting the Allied beachhead in two. For the American commanders, the Canadian concern was a matter of simple mathematics. The U.S. First Army was landing 2 divisions at Omaha and Utah. The British Second Army was landing 3. If the Center Division, the Canadians, collapsed, the Americans would be left fighting on an isolated peninsula. Eisenhower wrote in his diary about the terrible complexity of the operation. He knew that a failure at Juno was not just a Canadian problem, it was an alliance-ending problem. Yet, despite the doubts, the Canadians possessed a secret weapon that the Americans largely lacked in the first wave: armor. Under the command of Major General Rod Keller, the 3rd Canadian Division had fully embraced the unorthodox funny tanks designed by British General Percy Hobart. While American commanders like Bradley had largely declined the offer to use these specialized swimming tanks and mine-clearing flails, the Canadians had integrated them into their assault wave doctrine. The plan was for the DD tanks to land before the infantry, suppressing the German pillboxes. It was a high-risk gamble. In the rough seas of the Channel, these canvas-screened tanks were prone to sinking. If the tanks went down, the infantry would be hitting the seawall naked. As the Armada crossed the line of departure, the American liaisons aboard the headquarters ship HMS Hillary watched the chronometers. The tide at Juno was running high and fast. The Canadians had been forced to delay their H-hour by nearly 20 minutes compared to the Americans to allow the water to rise enough to clear the offshore reefs. This meant that by the time the Canadians hit the sand, the Germans would be fully alert. The element of surprise was gone. The sun was up. The kill zones were calibrated. The American generals watched the map, waiting for the radio reports. They expected a slow grind. They expected calls for reinforcements. What they were about to get was a lesson in shock warfare. While the American GIs at Omaha Beach were tragically forced to assault the bluffs largely without armored support, many of their tanks having swamped in the rough seas far from shore, the Canadians approached Juno with a radically different tactical doctrine. This divergence was not just a matter of supply, but of philosophy. American commanders, including General Bradley, had been offered the full array of General Percy Hobart's funnies, specialized tanks modified for specific battlefield tasks, but had largely declined them, viewing them as untested British gadgets that would complicate logistics. The Canadians, conversely, embraced them with the desperation of men who refused to repeat the infantry slaughter of the First World War. As the landing craft bore down on sectors Mike and Nan at Juno Beach, the Canadian infantry were not alone. Leading the wave were the duplex-drive Shermans. Unlike the disaster at Omaha, where tanks were launched too far out and sank, the Canadian naval commanders, gauging the ferocity of the waves, made a split-second, unauthorized decision to bring the tank landing craft much closer, within 1,000 yards of the beach, before launching the swimming tanks. It was a risky violation of protocol, but it saved the armor. When the ramps dropped, the Germans in the bunkers at Courseulles-sur-Mer were stunned. They expected soft-skinned infantry. Instead, they were met by 30-ton leviathans rising from the surf. But the true shock came from the AVRES, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. These were Churchill tanks modified to carry a massive 290mm Petard spigot mortar. The American observers monitoring radio traffic heard reports of concrete bunkers simply evaporating. The petard mortar fired a 40-pound projectile, the flying dustbin, that did not need to penetrate armor. The concussive blast alone shattered reinforced concrete and liquefied the organs of the men inside. At Courseulles-sur-Mer, when a German strongpoint pinned down the Queen's own rifles, it was not a wave of bodies that cleared it, but a single AVRE rolling up to point-blank range and cracking the bunker open like an egg. This technological integration allowed the Canadians to maintain momentum where pure grit would have failed. Miles away, aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood on the bridge, his attention divided. To his immediate front lay the nightmare of Omaha, where the American assault was disintegrating into chaos. But his eyes frequently darted to the maps of the eastern flank. Bradley was a general who thought in terms of leverage. He knew that if the British and Canadians failed to secure their beaches, the German reserves would pivot west and crush the tenuous American hold at Omaha. He was particularly concerned about the gap between the British 50th Division at Gold Beach and the Canadians at Juno. A gap in the line was an invitation for a panzer counterattack. His intelligence officers brought him fragmented updates from the British sector. The news from Juno was confusing at first. The Canadians had landed late. The tide was higher than expected, covering the beach obstacles and forcing the landing craft to drive right over mines. Landing craft were exploding. Casualties in the first wave were catastrophic, a 50% chance of death or injury for the men in the leading companies. But then, the tone of the reports shifted. Unlike the stalled situation at Omaha, the map markers for the 3rd Canadian Division began to move. They were not just holding the seawall, they were breaching it. Bradley noted a specific detail that surprised his staff: the Canadian rate of advance. They were moving off the beach faster than the British at Sword and Gold, and significantly faster than the Americans. This was not the cautious, methodical plotting the Americans sometimes associated with British Commonwealth forces. This was aggressive, almost reckless infiltration. The Canadian commander, Major General Rod Keller, had instilled a crash mentality in his officers. If a unit was pinned, they were to bypass and keep moving. For Bradley, watching the disaster at Omaha unfold, the radio traffic from Juno offered a glimmer of strategic hope. The Cinderella Army was not just holding its own, it was acting as a high-speed buzzsaw, chewing through the German defenses and drawing the enemy's eye away from the American crisis. The Canadians were doing exactly what the alliance needed, even if the cost in blood was mounting by the minute. Inside the concrete firing positions of the 716th Infantry Division, the German defenders were experiencing a shock that shattered their tactical worldview. These men were not the elite SS Panzer Grenadiers who would arrive later. They were a mix of older veterans, young conscripts, and Osttruppen, Eastern European volunteers. Their orders were simple: hold the Atlantic Wall. Their officers had assured them that any Allied landing would be stopped at the water's edge, crushed by the overlapping fields of fire from the resistance nests, known as Widerstands Nester. As the Canadian landing craft hit the sand, the German machine gunners opened up with devastating effect. But what terrified the defenders was not the number of ships. It was the behavior of the men swarming out of them. German doctrine relied on the enemy taking cover when fired upon, allowing mortars to finish them off. The Canadians did not take cover. Reports from the bunkers at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer described a relentless, almost suicidal aggression. When a Canadian platoon was pinned down by a machine gun post, they did not wait for air support. A sergeant or a corporal would simply sprint forward with a Bren gun or a bag of grenades, hurling themselves directly into the fire. For the German garrison commander at Courseulles, the battle rapidly devolved from a structured defense into a chaotic brawl. His communications lines were cut not by artillery, but by Canadian engineers who were physically dismantling his perimeter defenses by hand while under fire. The psychological impact was immense. The Germans were prepared to fight a mechanical war against tanks and planes. They were not prepared for the visceral, close-quarters ferocity of the Canadian infantry, who fought with a grim determination to settle the score for Dieppe. By mid-morning, the impenetrable Atlantic wall was not just breached, it was being cleared room by room, often with bayonets and knives. Down on the wet sand, the grand strategy of Generals Eisenhower and Bradley dissolved into a terrifyingly small world of survival for the men of the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment and the Queen's Own Rifles. At Sector Nan Red, the North Shore Regiment faced a nightmare scenario. The aerial bombardment had missed the German strongpoints. The town of Saint-Aubin lay directly behind the seawall, meaning the Canadians were not just storming a beach, they were storming a fortress village. As the ramp of LCA 806 dropped, Major J.A. Curry saw his men cut down in rows. But those who survived the initial burst did not freeze. The fighting here was unique in the Normandy invasion. While Americans at Omaha fought up bluffs and British at Gold fought through marshy flats, the Canadians at Juno were immediately thrust into vicious urban combat. They were clearing houses before they had even dried off. Private diaries recovered later paint a harrowing picture. Men from the Canadian maritime provinces, fishermen, farmers, lumberjacks, found themselves sprinting through the narrow cobbled streets of French resort towns, kicking in doors and clearing German snipers from rooftops. There was no time for command decisions from high above. It was a corporal's war. One section of the Queen's Own Rifles, tasked with clearing a massive concrete bunker complex, found their grenades bouncing off the firing slits. Without hesitation, 2 riflemen flanked the position, climbed onto the roof of the bunker, and fired through the vents, silencing the gun crew. This was not standard operating procedure found in any manual. It was raw improvisation born of adrenaline and the lethal realization that hesitation meant death. The human cost of this aggression was staggering. In the first hour, the leading companies suffered 50% casualties. The tide was turning red, washing the bodies of the fallen back and forth against the tank obstacles. But crucially, the survivors did not stop to mourn. They stepped over their friends, pushed through the seawall gaps, and began to form up in the ruined streets. They checked their magazines, lit cigarettes with shaking hands, and looked inland. The beach was taken. Now, the real race began. By 1200 hours, the situation at Juno Beach had shifted from a desperate amphibious assault to a frantic high-stakes race against time. The Canadians had achieved what many planners at Shaft feared was impossible. They had smashed the Atlantic Wall. But as the adrenaline of the beach landing faded, a new, colder reality set in. They were now exposed, strung out along narrow French country roads, deep in enemy territory. The beaches behind them were a scene of organized chaos. The tide, now receding, revealed the twisted wreckage of landing craft and the bodies of the morning's dead. But the focus of the battle had moved inland. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, the reserve force, began to land. These men, fresh and dry, rode their bicycles and Bren carriers through the smoking ruins of Courseulles-sur-Mer, passing the exhausted survivors of the initial assault who were now digging in among the rubble. The order from General Keller was clear and unforgiving: push on. There was to be no consolidation, no waiting for the flanks to catch up. The objective was the N13 highway and the Carpiquet airfield, strategic prizes that lay tantalizingly out of reach, miles through the bocage. As the Canadian columns pushed south, they entered the bocage country, a claustrophobic patchwork of small fields divided by ancient, thick hedgerows. To an American observer accustomed to the open plains of the Midwest, this terrain was a nightmare. Every hedgerow was a potential fortress, every turn in the road a potential ambush. The tension was suffocating. The Canadians were advancing blind. Their radios crackled with confused reports. To their right, the British 50th Division was fighting hard but lagging behind. To their left, the British 3rd Division was bogged down by heavy resistance near Caen. This meant the Canadians were driving a salient, a protruding finger, deep into the German lines. They were the tip of the Allied spear, but the shaft was dangerously thin. At Courseulles-sur-Mer, just 3 miles inland, the Canadian artillery began to set up. The Royal Canadian Artillery self-propelled guns, the priests, had landed and were firing over the heads of the advancing infantry. The roar was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the ground. But amidst the noise, the veteran sergeants listened for a different sound, the high-pitched whine of German engines. Allied intelligence had warned them. The 21st Panzer Division, the hammer of the German defense in Normandy, was stationed just south of Caen. It was fully equipped with Mark IV tanks and anti-tank guns. At 1400 hours, aerial reconnaissance spotted dust clouds moving north. The panzers were coming. The American generals, monitoring the situation from the command ships, held their breath. They knew the physics of the battlefield. The Canadians were infantry-heavy, tired, and overextended. If the 21st Panzer hit them now in the open before they could dig in, the Canadian division could be cut off and annihilated. It would be a repeat of Dieppe, but on a massive scale. Yet the Canadians did not stop. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers continued to drive south. They were moving so fast that they actually outran their own communications. In the command tents back on the beach, the grease pencil markers on the map simply stopped moving because the units were off the known grid. They were entering the fog of war in the truest sense. At Villons-le-Buisson, the vanguard of the Canadian force spotted the spires of Caen in the distance. They were further inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day. They had penetrated the crust of the German defense and were looking into the soft underbelly of the occupation. But as they crested the ridge, the lead tanks slammed on their brakes. Across the valley, the hedgerows began to dissolve into muzzle flashes. The horizon rippled with the distinctive crack thump of German 88mm guns. The 21st Panzer Division had arrived. The race was over. The collision was about to begin. The collision at the edge of Villons-le-Buisson was not a singular cinematic charge, but a violent, disjointed series of duels that would decide the fate of the invasion center. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers, commanding the Sherman tanks supporting the infantry, were the first to spot the German armor. But these were not just standard Shermans. Scattered among the Canadian troops were the Sherman Fireflies, tanks retrofitted with the massive British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This was the ace up the Allied sleeve that American commanders had largely lacked at Omaha. The 17-pounder was the only Allied gun capable of tearing through the frontal armor of a heavy German tank at combat range. As the reconnaissance elements of the 21st Panzer Division probed the Canadian lines, expecting to roll over light infantry, they were met with a shocking retort. The fireflies opened up from the tree lines. The high-velocity crack of the 17-pounders shattered the evening air. German Mark IV tanks, accustomed to dominating the battlefield, suddenly found themselves outgunned. Burning steel hulks began to dot the rape fields south of Courseulles-sur-Mer. Simultaneously, a dramatic strategic crisis was unfolding to the east. Elements of the 21st Panzer had actually found a gap between the Canadians at Juno and the British at Sword. A column of German infantry and tanks managed to drive all the way to the ocean, effectively splitting the Allied beachhead. It was the nightmare scenario Eisenhower had dreaded. But this is where the depth of the Canadian advance saved the day. Because the North Nova Scotia Highlanders had pushed so aggressively inland, further than any other Allied unit, they were now positioned on the flank of this German breakthrough. The German commanders realized that if they committed their force to the beach, the Canadians would simply swing east and cut off their rear, encircling them. The Canadian aggression forced the Germans to make a fatal choice. Instead of driving the Americans and British into the sea, the 21st Panzer was forced to pull back and turn to face this brazen Canadian threat, digging in near Carpiquet. The Cinderella Army had acted as a strategic magnet, drawing the armor away from the vulnerable beaches. As dusk began to settle over Normandy, the battlefield became a surreal landscape. The sky was choked with the smoke of burning villages and the exhaust of thousands of vehicles. The noise of battle began to recede, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the clinking of entrenching tools. General Keller, receiving reports of the massive German armored buildup to his front, now known to be the vanguard of the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, arriving for the next day's fight, made the controversial decision to halt. The Canadians were miles ahead of their support. To push further into the darkness against fresh panzers would be suicide. The order went down the line: dig in. Prepare for counterattack. The men of the 3rd Canadian Division stopped. They were exhausted, their faces blackened with cordite and grime. They had stormed a fortress wall, fought through urban centers, and advanced nearly 7 miles into hostile territory. They had taken their objectives, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the adrenaline crashed. The silence that followed was heavy with the knowledge that the element of surprise was gone. Tomorrow, the Germans would not be surprised. Tomorrow, the SS would be here. But for tonight, the line held. The beachhead was secure. The Americans at Omaha were finally moving inland, shielded by the chaos the Canadians were causing in the center. As darkness finally enveloped the Normandy coast on the night of June 6th, the chaotic noise of battle was replaced by the mechanical hum of logistics and the grim work of the medical corps. On Juno Beach, the tide had receded, leaving behind a debris field that looked less like a military operation and more like a shipwreck. The statistics that began to filter up to SHAF headquarters told a story of brutal efficiency. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had suffered 961 casualties on D-Day, with approximately 340 killed in action. While these numbers were tragic, representing nearly double the casualties of the Americans at Utah Beach, they were significantly lower than the bloodbath at Omaha. Given that Juno was arguably the second most heavily defended sector, this statistical discrepancy stunned Allied analysts. It was a testament to the sheer speed and aggression of the Canadian assault. They had moved through the kill zones before the German artillery could fully zero in. But the most telling statistic was not the body count. It was the mileage. By midnight, Canadian units controlled a solid block of territory, roughly 10 to 12 kilometers deep. They had linked up with the British 50th Division at Gold Beach to the west, creating a continuous Allied front of nearly 15 miles. For the American generals, this was the critical validation of the entire left flank strategy. General Omar Bradley's staff, reviewing the situation maps, saw that the Canadians had effectively put a steel cork in the bottle of the German counterattack. By penetrating so deep, so fast, they had denied the Germans the assembly areas needed to launch a coordinated strike against the vulnerable American beaches. However, the mood in the Canadian foxholes near Villon-le-Buisson was not one of triumph, but of profound unease. The men digging into the Norman clay knew they had kicked a hornet's nest. Interrogation of German prisoners taken late in the day revealed a chilling fact. The units facing them were no longer just the static coastal defense troops. They were identifying patches of the 21st Panzer Division, and ominous radio intercepts suggested the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was moving up rapidly from the south. The psychological toll on the Canadian troops was immense. They had been awake for over 24 hours. They were drenched, covered in salt and mud, and many were suffering from the shock of seeing lifelong friends dismembered in seconds. Yet, the discipline held. Officers moved down the lines, ensuring machine guns were sighted and grenades were primed. They knew that the Germans preferred to counterattack at dawn. In the command tents, the strategic reality of the aftermath was becoming clear. The Canadians had not just won a beach, they had accepted the role of the anvil. By threatening Caen, they had guaranteed that the bulk of the German armor would be thrown at them. It was a death sentence for many of the men who had just survived the landing, but it was the only way to ensure the Americans could break out in the West. The victory at Juno was merely the opening move in a summer-long war of attrition that would bleed the Canadian Army white. The success at Juno Beach rippled far beyond the tactical maps of Normandy. It fundamentally altered the Allied strategic calculus for the liberation of Europe. In the days that followed, the true weight of the Canadian achievement became clear to the Supreme Command. By successfully threatening Caen, the Canadians had inadvertently volunteered for the grim role of the sacrificial magnet. General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery realized that the German High Command was obsessed with the Canadian sector. The ferocity of the 3rd Division's advance had convinced the Germans that the primary Allied thrust was aimed directly at Paris via Caen. As a result, the Wehrmacht stripped their reserves from the American front and threw them against the Canadians and British. This was the anvil strategy in action. For weeks, the Canadian Army would be hammered by the elite of the German military, the 1st SS, 12th SS, and Panzer Lehr divisions. They would endure relentless shelling and counterattacks in the fields around Carpiquet and Caen. It was a brutal, grinding war of attrition that cost thousands of Canadian lives. But it was this sacrifice that allowed the American forces under General Bradley to build up their strength relatively unmolested and eventually launch Operation Cobra, the breakout that shattered the German line. The American generals, initially skeptical of the colonial forces, watched this unfold with a newfound respect. The narrative in the command trailers changed. The Canadians were no longer seen as a junior auxiliary to the British. They were recognized as shock troops capable of absorbing punishment that would have broken lesser units. General Bradley later acknowledged the vital role played by the Anglo-Canadian forces in holding the German armor, admitting that without their stubborn defense of the eastern flank, the American breakout would have been impossible. Technologically, the battle was a vindication of the funny tanks. The success of the Canadian armor at Juno forced a re-evaluation of specialized engineering vehicles within the U.S. Army. While the Americans never fully adopted the wide range of funnies used by the British and Canadians, the lesson was learned. Courage alone is often not enough against concrete and steel. Diplomatically, Juno Beach was the moment Canada stepped out of Britain's shadow. The coordination, the command style, and the distinct tactical aggression were uniquely Canadian. They had fought under a British Army command, yes, but the execution was born of a national character that had been forged in the trenches of Vimy Ridge and hardened by the tragedy of Dieppe. They had proven they could execute the most complex amphibious operation in history on one of its hardest beaches, and they had done so with a professional lethality that silenced the critics. Today, the coastline of Courseulles-sur-Mer is quiet. The roar of the 17-pounders and the scream of the Nebelwerfers have been replaced by the sound of waves and the laughter of tourists. The concrete bunkers, once the teeth of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, now sit as silent, moss-covered tombstones sinking slowly into the sand. But if you walk through the rows of the Courseulles-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery, you begin to understand the true cost of the respect earned on June 6, 1944. Here lie the men who proved the American generals wrong. They were not the untried colonials or the junior partners of the alliance. They were the steel tip of the spear. For commanders like Eisenhower and Bradley, the revelation of Juno Beach was profound. They witnessed a transformation that military history rarely sees, a force rising from the ashes of a past disaster, Dieppe, to execute one of the most complex and violent operations of the war with surgical precision. The Canadians did not just hold their sector, they drove deeper than anyone else, creating the strategic anchor that allowed the liberation of Western Europe to proceed. The legacy of Juno is not just about territory taken or bunkers destroyed. It is about the validation of a nation. In the fires of Normandy, the Canadian Army stepped out of the shadow of the British Empire and stood shoulder to shoulder with the superpowers of the 20th century. They proved that the size of an army is less important than its spirit, its training, and its willingness to endure the unendurable. The Cinderella Army had gone to the ball, but they had not worn glass slippers. They wore hobnailed boots, and they kicked the door down. As the sun set on D-Day, the American generals looking east no longer saw a question mark. They saw the anvil upon which the victory in Europe would be forged.